But anyway, I want to introduce myself. My name is Representative Eric Hutchings. I have served in the Utah State Legislature now since 2001. It makes me the second longest serving member of the Utah House, so I'm kind of the old fart over there, which is kind of fun. It's a neat position to be in. I serve as the Speaker Pro Tem, and I have done a lot in the Utah House on criminal justice-related budget issues, and we did our Justice Reinvestment Initiative a few years ago, and I was the chief sponsor on that one, and so it's been an honor to work with NCSL. Those of you that haven't had the opportunity before to work with them, even outside of these types of meetings, you need to take the chance to do that. Their staff and their expertise are exceptional, tremendous asset. And if you haven't taken advantage of them working with you on model legislation or things of that nature, then you really should. And to those of you that have been in other rooms with me in other parts of the country, it's excellent to see all of you again. There's an awful lot of passion in the legislatures of this country, especially on this particular issue. And there has been an awful lot of work for a lot of years. So we're coming back around on this particular topic simply because the federal government, as all of you are aware, has not yet taken cannabis off of a Schedule I list, which means that they have listed it as having addictive properties and, in all practical purposes, no medicinal benefits of any kind. And so it is still left on that Schedule I list, and so it's been left up to us. The previous administration was pretty straightforward about the fact that they were just kind of going to let states work on it, sort of let it go. They encouraged prosecutors not to deal with it much. There has been some sense that that's changing or may change. And so we've been left as legislatures to kind of figure out where we want to go with it, what we want to do with it, how we're going to regulate it, how we're going to moderate it, what level we want to legalize it within our states. And it's left us in a bit of a conundrum as far as how do we do that, especially when you have issues with people crossing state boundaries and things like that. So without any further ado, though, you guys, we've got a guest speaker with us today, Professor Robert Mikos. Did I pronounce that correctly? Mikos. I knew I was going to get that backwards. But we're thrilled to have him here. Every once in a while, you get to meet somebody who's got a pedigree that you're not exactly sure you ought to be on the same stage with. But anyway, I'll just read that off a little bit. So Professor Mikos, right? Mikos? Twice in a row. Look at that.
I'll write it.
It's because my native language is Chinese, and I screw up all the accents. I apologize. One of the nation's leading authorities on cannabis law and policy. He has written, testified, and lectured extensively on the struggles among federal, state, and local control. He's also completed a pioneering textbook on marijuana law, policy, and authority. And in addition to all of that, he has earned his A.B. cum laude from Princeton, his J.D. summa cum laude from the University of Michigan, clerked for Chief Judge Michael Bodine. Did I get that one even close?
Close.
Let's just humor me. I apologize. Of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and he now teaches constitutional law, federalism, and marijuana law and policy at Vanderbilt. And everybody, just take a moment before I introduce our other panelists to welcome Professor Mikos.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Third time's a charm. Really, really good to have you here. Our other two panelists, so we'll have him speak first. We are fairly short on time, so we intend to go about 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and then we want to have a lot of Q&A at the end of it. So we'll have the professor speak first, and then Senator Roger Katz. Cates? I'm telling you. You thought I was joking about the Chinese thing, but 真的, 我的中文比我的英文好多了. I'll tell you. It's bad. It's so bad. So we'll have the senator speak with us. The senator is from California.
No.
Maine.
These are backwards. You know, it'd be cool if you had the same kind of leeway you had when you were on the dais in your own legislature, right? That people just nodded and pretended you knew what you were talking about. So served as the mayor of Augusta for 2 terms, and then being elected to represent Maine's 15th Senate District, right, in 2010. And a member of Maine's Cannabis Legalization Implementation Committee, and has helped to draft a lot of their cannabis-related legislation. And we're thrilled to have you here, Senator. It's great to have somebody who's got your kind of background and boots on the ground expertise. And then last is Representative Reggie Jones Sawyer. See, it just took a little while to get warmed up. He represents District 59 here in the California House, which apparently is pretty close to where we're at. Is that accurate? Walking distance from here. So dinner, drinks at his house tonight. Covering most of the South LA area, Representative Jones Sawyer has done extensive work on cannabis legislation in the California legislature, with his most recent efforts bolstering state industry protections, both in response to increased federal scrutiny that we're going to address today, and following the passage of California's Proposition 64, which he can speak more to in detail. And so with that, everybody, please help me welcome Professor Mikos.
I think I'll stay seated. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's always an honor to come out here and speak to the NCSL. I've been asked to talk about a lot of different topics today, so of necessity, I'll have to be brief, but I wanted to let you know about some resources that you can use to help answer any questions you might have about marijuana law and policy. I put those up there on the board. This includes the textbook that Eric mentioned, Marijuana Law, Policy, and Authority. Notwithstanding the fact that it has law in the name of it, it is accessible to non-lawyers. Don't be afraid of it. And I think you might find it useful, and you can get a copy on Amazon. I've also created a companion website for the book where I regularly will write about breaking developments in the field of marijuana law. The web address is up there, and you have a few samples from that website in your handouts. And lastly, you can always email me. I'm easy to find and happy to chat formally or informally about any questions you might have. So without further ado, let me start by giving you a quick overview of the status of marijuana reforms in the states. This map that I have up here on the board, which is also in your handouts, shows you what the states have done to date. There are lots of differences across state laws, but I think it's still helpful for us to put them into one of 4 basic categories according to the type of reform, if any, that they pursued. The green states up there, which are 9 states plus the District of Columbia, have adopted the broadest reforms. They've legalized marijuana not only for medical purposes, but also for recreational or adult use. The red states up there, and there are 22 of those, have legalized marijuana, but only for medical uses. The gray states up there are 18 of those, if you're keeping track, have adopted the most modest reforms. Like red states, they've legalized marijuana for medical purposes, but only when the drug contains little or no THC. That's a psychoactive component in marijuana. So we call these CBD states. Well, if you're doing the math here, that leaves only 1 state, and if you don't recognize it up on the board, the white state up there, if you forget your grade school geography, I'll give you a hint. It rhymes with potato. It's Idaho. There's only 1 state in the country right now that bans marijuana outright, bans the drug in all its forms for all purposes. So that's the current state of state marijuana reforms. It's much easier to describe federal law, at least as that law is written. Like Idaho, federal law continues to ban marijuana outright. And as you know, that federal ban complicates the task you have to implement reforms like those up on the board. Even though that ban is still on the books, however, there have been a few notable developments this past year at the federal level that overall might make it a bit easier for you as state lawmakers to regulate marijuana as you see fit. The first of these developments happened back in January when the United States Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, rescinded marijuana enforcement guidance that had been issued by the Obama administration. This guidance, known colloquially as the Ogden and Cole Memoranda, had suggested that the DOJ wouldn't prosecute anyone who was acting in compliance with state marijuana laws. At the time, the Attorney General's announcement stoked fears that the DOJ was going to try to undo all of these colorful state reforms. But those fears have proven unfounded. My handout explains why in more detail, but let me highlight two reasons why the DOJ hasn't and indeed won't initiate a crackdown on the marijuana industry. For one thing, Congress has tied the DOJ's hands, at least with respect to medical marijuana. In each budget it has passed since 2014, Congress has barred the DOJ from spending any of its funds to prosecute marijuana users and suppliers who are obeying state medical marijuana laws. This means that even if the Attorney General wanted to crack down on the medical marijuana industry, he couldn't do it. He lacks the power. A second reason the DOJ has held back is that the agency simply doesn't have the spare resources that would be needed to mount an effective campaign against today's marijuana industry. So even without enforcement guidance, even without those spending restrictions Congress has imposed, there's really not much the DOJ could do at this point to put the cat back in the bag. So while this particular development, the rescission, didn't necessarily make your jobs any easier, didn't make it easier for you to pursue reforms, I don't think it's actually made it harder either. The second big development came from the Supreme Court this spring in a case that on the surface has nothing to do with marijuana. It's Murphy versus NCAA. The case arose a few years ago when the state of New Jersey tried to repeal an old state ban on sports gambling. Several sports leagues, including the NCAA, sued New Jersey under an obscure federal law known as PASPA. That's the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. PASPA, in relevant part, prohibited the states from, quote, authorizing or licensing sports gambling. The leagues won in the lower courts, which enjoined New Jersey's repeal of its ban, effectively forcing the state to continue to keep banning sports gambling. New Jersey, however, convinced the Supreme Court to grant cert in the case, and even more importantly, convinced the Supreme Court that PASPA is unconstitutional. In particular, the court held that the federal statute violated the anti-commandeering rule. And in so doing, the court endorsed an interpretation of that rule that I've been espousing for nearly a decade, namely that the anti-commandeering rule empowers the states to legalize an activity for purposes of state law, even when Congress forbids the same activity. So although Murphy involves sports gambling, it applies naturally to marijuana and other activities as well. The decision doesn't empower you to do whatever you want with respect to marijuana, but it should put an end to a variety of lawsuits that are claiming that your state reforms are preempted to the extent that they authorize or license the possession, cultivation, or distribution of marijuana. The third noteworthy development at the federal level actually occurred in Congress, and it was likely prompted by the Attorney General's announcement back in January. Senators Cory Gardner of Colorado and Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts introduced bipartisan legislation that would dramatically change federal law governing medical marijuana. The proposal is called the States Act, and to simplify somewhat, the States Act would turn federal supremacy on its head. It would empower state lawmakers to legalize the possession, manufacture, and distribution of medical marijuana under federal and not just state law. So federal law would adopt the red, gray, and gray that you see up here up on the map. If it passed, the States Act would be a really big deal. States could remove all of the obstacles that medical marijuana users and suppliers now face because of the federal ban on marijuana. Those suppliers, for example, could get federal trademark and bankruptcy protection, as well as financial services from federally regulated banks. Now, of course, Congress, I think, may not pass the STATES Act, or may not do so anytime soon. Nonetheless, I want to call your attention to a little-known fact, and that's that Congress has already given you the power to turn off the federal marijuana ban in some limited circumstances. And let me give you one quick example as I wrap up today. The example involves drug paraphernalia. This is basically equipment that people use to consume or produce marijuana. Think of vape pens, think of grow lights, for example. Right now, the Federal Controlled Substances Act bans this equipment. That ban is found in 21 U.S.C. Section 863. I've got the text up on the board. However, when Congress adopted this ban back in the 1980s, it also snuck in an obscure and hence little-used provision that enables states to turn off this federal ban by specifically authorizing marijuana paraphernalia under state law. In other words, under this provision, subsection F up there, if a state passes a law that specifically authorizes the sale and possession of drug paraphernalia under state law, that law would also make the possession, manufacture, and distribution of these devices legal under federal law as well. Now, this isn't a cure-all, of course. It only deals with one segment of the industry, but it would help companies that are sort of at the periphery of these marijuana reforms. And it provides just one example of what state lawmakers can do as they wait for Congress to take up perhaps broader reforms sometime in the future. All right, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Roger.
Thank you. I'll go up here so I can, some of you couldn't see over there. My name's Roger Cates. I'm from Maine. I want to tell you a little bit about our Maine experience, but before I do that, I just want to note that most of us have one thing in common. We all got elected in our home districts. We all have our roads to victory. I just want to tell you quickly about mine. When I started to run for the first time, I reached out to one of the older senators, one of the more experienced ones, and asked him the secret to success. And he said, Roger, here's what's worked for me. You can fool some of the people some of the time, and those are the ones you should concentrate on. It's worked out pretty well for 4 terms for me. Our main experience with marijuana goes back to 1999, when we were one of the first states that passed medical marijuana. And I think we've learned there are 3 truisms from that experience. First, that the federal government impediments are still there. Despite the fact that the feds have kept hands off for the most part, it's still almost entirely a cash business because of the unwillingness of most banks and most credit unions, not all, to get involved in taking accounts and working with people. And certainly the ability to borrow money is extremely limited, or get insurance. I think the second thing we've learned in Maine is that there's been a general acceptance of medical marijuana and its efficacy. Even some of my most conservative colleagues, one came up to me a couple of weeks ago and said, you know, my mother has terrible rheumatoid arthritis, and she is helped by her medical marijuana prescription. So it's 1 degree of separation. We all know someone who feels at least that they've been helped by medical marijuana. So it isn't going away in state policy. The third thing is that despite that general acceptance, there's still a fair amount of abuse in the medical marijuana system. Most caregivers are ethical and are in it for the right reasons, but there is that small percentage that are basically outlaws who are using the medical marijuana system as a way to grow and divert into the black market, and that's something we struggle with all the time. So adult use, cannabis, recreational marijuana, whatever you want to call it, the Maine legislature has dealt with that on several occasions and never passed it. So the advocates instituted a citizens referendum back in 2016, got it on the ballot, not that hard to accomplish in Maine, and it passed by the narrowest of margins. It allowed, in general, possession of up to 2.5 ounces for personal use, allowed people to grow up to 6 plants, and had a 19-page bill behind it, not terribly well thought out, talking about implementation of that. So our presiding officers in the Maine legislature appointed a joint select committee on marijuana legalization to write the real implementing language for the bill. It's a joint select committee. People laugh about that, said don't get down in the weeds, and we've heard them all. If you have a new one, I'll be very, very surprised. But we had a very interesting committee, all the way from, on one side, a state representative who thought that marijuana shouldn't be regulated any more than the growth of tomatoes, all the way to the other side of the spectrum, to someone who felt that marijuana was the product of the devil. So it was an interesting process, and we spent 8 months going through that process, and were eventually able to get to a consensus. It was a fascinating enterprise for those of you who are legislators. Generally, we're seeing bills that are brought to us. We work them, we change them, we amend them, we tweak them, and out they go with majority or minority reports. But here we were really starting almost entirely from scratch, more akin to starting with a budget, if you will, a budget document. And over 8 months, we were able to get there. We passed it out of committee, about 15-1. We passed it in the House, we passed it in the Senate. Our governor vetoed it, and we were unable to override the veto. So it was back to the drawing boards again, and going through that process for another 4 months, we were finally able to get something passed. Again, the governor vetoed it, but this time we were able to override. So just telling you a little bit about our experience. Every state is different, but we listened to a lot of stakeholders. We listened to people who were proponents of the referendum, people who were opposed to it, the Maine Municipal Association, the Christian Civic League, caregivers, dispensaries in the medical field, and obviously legislative leadership on both sides of the aisle. And we went back to the drawing boards, as I said. The key components of Maine's legislation, which I can tell you about, one is we've kept the medical system separate. We have not combined those. I don't have much doubt that in 20 years there will be a system of marijuana, not two siloed systems, but for now we kept the medical system, in part in response to, as the professor was saying, concerns about federal law. Feds have pretty much said hands off on medical. We're not quite so sure what their attitude is going to be on recreational marijuana. So we've kept them separate. Although we did have oversight of both programs, the medical and the recreational or the adult use side, under one agency, because so much of it ought to be consistent and common. Things like packaging and labeling and testing. There's no reason why those ought to be two separate systems or two separate ways, but they ought to be consistent. So in Maine, what we did was we favored Maine residents in all of these licenses. The legislature as a whole pretty much agreed that this new industry is going to come to Maine. We want to have Mainers have the first shot at that. We've actually imposed a 4-year Maine residency requirement for someone to get a license under this system, a concept which I'm sure would offend Professor Michos. There is something called the Commerce Clause, but we'll see. We have licenses for nurseries, that is, growing the initial small plants, licenses for cultivation, licenses for manufacturing, licenses for retail sales, and licenses for test laboratories. We have set up some pretty strong prohibitions in the packaging and licensing area, packaging and labeling area, all in an effort to try to keep this out of the hands of kids as much as we can. In advertising, there's no cartoon characters. Packaging, no animal shapes allowed, no bright colors that would attract kids, no advertising or marketing that has a likelihood of reaching persons under the age of 21. Tamper-proof packaging, standards for labeling so that people know what dosage they're getting, what product they're getting, THC content, the universal marijuana system, health and dietary information, as you might expect. So we've included that. We have, every step of the way, I think it's safe to say that we have gone conservative and we have gone slow. The bill we passed is marijuana 1.0, and I'm sure there'll be marijuana 2.0 next year, and so on and so forth. Prohibition was done away with, I don't know how many, almost 100 years ago now, and as in your legislature as well as in ours, every year we see a lot of bills dealing with how we're going to regulate the use and the sale of alcohol. And I'm sure it'll be the same with marijuana as well. One of the key things that we have in our legislation is the concept of local control. Yes, marijuana, the adult system is now legal in the state of Maine, but under the way we have drafted our legislation, every town, every city can decide for itself if they want to have any or all of these licensed activities going on within their borders. So Augusta, where I'm from, might decide, for instance, no, we don't want to have cultivation, but we'll have retail stores and we only want to allow 3. Portland might say we want to allow all of it, and we're going to have many licenses for each of those categories. The small town of Oakland, Maine might decide we don't want to have any of these activities going on within the borders of Oakland. And we've made that local control a centerpiece of this legislation, in part, frankly, to help get it passed. Because although the marijuana law, the referendum passed by the slimmest of margins, the fact is that if you look at our House districts, the majority of House districts voted against it. It was in very much the urban areas where very heavy majorities gave the necessary votes to pass the thing. So local control was a big part of it, and we've made it an opt-in system, by the way. That is, if a town doesn't do anything, no one can be licensed in that local town. So we've made it an opt-in system, and that was a big subject of discussion. So you have to, first of all, in Maine now get a state license to engage in one of these activities. Then you have to take that license to the town where you want to operate, and you have to get their blessing as well. So we were successful in overriding the veto. Now it's off to rulemaking. A great deal of this, no matter what state you're in, is going to be done in rulemaking. And if you're going through this process, I'd really encourage you to reach out to other states that have gone through this. We learned so much from talking with our colleagues in Colorado in particular, but also in Washington, in Oregon, and in Washington, D.C., other places which had passed it before us. Learn from their experience and learn from their mistakes. We're all facing the same issues, but the local culture that you have in your own states is going to inform about how you go about it, just as it did with us in Maine. So again, we went conservative in a lot of ways, partly because it passed by such a narrow margin. We didn't want to get too far ahead of ourselves on it. For instance, the original proposal had a provision for social clubs, think marijuana bars, if you will. We decided not to do that. We prohibited internet sales. We prohibited home delivery. We limited the number of plants. As I said, the referendum had called for 6. We lowered that down to 3. And we did everything we could to promulgate policies which would discourage the diversion of marijuana from a legal growing situation into the black market, and certainly to going out of state. I'm looking back on it and seeing where we are in 2018 in this country. I don't know that it is any more a question of whether to legalize or not. I mean, in Maine, although I actually voted against it, I wanted to let other states get a little more ahead of us and learn from them. But in Maine, clearly people are using marijuana. They're going to use marijuana whether it's legal or not. And the question is, are they going to be buying from Joe down on the corner, or are they going to be buying from a legal seller so that they know they're getting tested, pure, well-dosed, well-labeled, and well-packaged products that, by the way, we can now tax as an additional source of state revenue. And by the way, in taxation, we went with a 10% point of sales tax, and also about another 10% at the wholesale level, at the cultivation level as an excise tax. So what can we do to make sure that people will have a safe source? And the research actually is, at least in Colorado, the teen usage of marijuana after legalization really hasn't even gone up. It stayed about the same. So my own thoughts on the subject were crystallized. We went out to Colorado to meet with people out there that were most helpful to us. And I was walking in downtown Denver, and there in the corner, I see 3 guys smoking a joint on the corner. And I'm thinking to myself, is this really what we want to bring back to the state of Maine? And then I flew back to Maine and flew into Portland and went into downtown Portland. And what did I see? 3 guys on the corner smoking a joint. So it's here. Let's do it the right way. We are comforted by the fact that we think that the federal government will keep their hands off. Our U.S. attorney hasn't indicated anything different. So again, the last thing I would say that no state has the magic way to do this. A lot of it's going to be controlled by your own politics, by what you can get passed, by how you want to handle it, by how much you value local control. But I feel free to reach out to those of us in Maine, but also other states. We're all anxious to help and have you learn from our mistakes and have you learn from our experience. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Reggie Jones Sawyer. I represent South Los Angeles, and I am an assemblyman in the California State Assembly. And just in full disclosure, you probably could tell by the way I'm dressed that I'm not real shy, and I'm really not real shy about this subject. And for those of you who've taken a cautious view, I understand that, but I'm not one of those individuals. And California and its electorate have taken a bold step into not only legalizing medical and adult use cannabis. It's been a long, hard road. Started in '72, and I'll just kind of go through some of it. But making sure you understand where I come from. Not only have I been moving for this and the decriminalization of cannabis, especially as it impacts minorities and people from my district, South Los Angeles, and how it's been used for the school-to-prison pipeline and other things. I'm pretty sure, now that I probably can say that in front of this room, I'm probably the first, with Melissa Etheridge, politician to smoke cannabis on stage in front of a lot of people. And if you don't believe me, Google my name, Melissa Etheridge, and you'll see us with a vape pen in our hand getting high. And the reason I did it, because in a lot of communities, even though it's legal, there's still a lot of people who are scared to death because of the adverse impacts of it. And coming from Hollywood, I can understand that. You know, in 1936, there was a movie called Reefer Madness, where somebody took one hit. I heard some oh yeahs in here. Next thing you know, people are raping and pillaging the neighborhoods and driving crazy. That's in '36. Almost 6 years later, for the younger folks, there was a movie called Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which incidentally had 3 Academy Award winners, Sean Penn, Forrest Whitaker, and Nicholas Coppola, who later became Nicolas Cage, in that movie. But there they had weed smoking. It's just people who were lazy, didn't study. So we've gone from it drove you insane to it just made you lazy. And so for California, it's changed over a long period in time. There's been decriminalization activities going on since 1972. When California put on the ballot to decriminalize cannabis, it failed. Then in 1976, then young governor, Jerry Brown, did the Moscone Act, which took cannabis from a felony down to a misdemeanor. And to show total bipartisanship, in 2010, then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger took it down from a criminal misdemeanor down to a civil infraction, basically a traffic ticket. So California has been moving in this direction for quite some time. And the keys to why we became a little more involved in this was because our criminal population, I'm the chair of public safety, and so I've been to more prisons than I've ever wanted to in my entire life. And a lot of people I've seen, and 155,000 people now down to 130,000 are incarcerated in California. A lot of them look like me. A lot of them, when you look down at their records, it started with cannabis. And so the three-court judge, which we were under an order to reduce it by 55,000 inmates, with some very draconian efforts, which also pushed a lot of the lower offenders out into communities, out into the jails, which now are overpopulated. They never really solved the problem of why the 3 strikes was used to basically undermine a whole community. And so California started to look at that. And California said if cannabis, marijuana was one of the causes, then we need to move to another way of dealing with it. We need to move to a way of looking at it. If it's a health problem, once you go to the next level. And then medical marijuana. For me, the reason I got involved, I got elected in 2012. I had smoked cannabis in 1979. I was with my father-in-law who had cancer in 2011, and he couldn't eat. He had throat cancer. Cannabis helped him. In fact, I took him to a cannabis store, scared to death because I was running for office. So I understand. I get it. You don't get busted at that time in a cannabis shop having someone taking a picture of you. But I went in, and it was a different place. It wasn't what I thought it would be. And then I started meeting more seniors who had chronic illnesses like arthritis. Started meeting young people who had chronic illnesses, epilepsy and others. I've met veterans with PTSD that this helped them. Instead of a whole trough full of vitamins and pharmaceuticals, they could use this instead, and the side effects were a whole lot less worse. And then I met cancer patients like him, and then I met AIDS patients who used it. So in 1996, we did do the Proposition 215, which is called the Compassionate Use Act, where 55.6% of the electorate actually voted for it. And we started our medical marijuana operations here in California. Because we still were we weren't really there yet, it wasn't until 2015, think about it, 8 or 9 years later, we wrote the regulations for medical cannabis. It took us that long because we couldn't get it through the legislature. It was a hard fight to get it through. And it was a group of us, Assembly Members Bonta, Cooley, Jones Sawyer, Lackey, Wood, and Senator McGuire. We were Republican, we were Democrat, white, API, from Northern California, Southern California, Central, from the Golden Triangle, where most of the cannabis is built, is farmed. We were Eagle Scouts, ex-Marines, Mormons. We represented everyone. And the reason we put this coalition together, because one, it had never been done in California, bringing a coalition of what is representative California together to get this done. But we also knew it was an extremely heavy lift. And we were able to get that passed in 2015. The regulations we got passed in 2015 with AB 266. And just to let you know, and this is just personal privilege, the reason we were able to get in 1996 the compassionate use done is because a 60-year-old woman named Brownie Mary Ratham was arrested for baking marijuana brownies, and it caused a firestorm back then. The reason why it bothers me, because I'm 61, and I don't think I'm that old. By us getting that done and putting our egos to the side, we were able to come up with basically the blueprint of what eventually came Proposition 64, which legalized both adult use and medical marijuana here in California. A lot of what we needed to do, and we call it the Adult Use of Marijuana Act of 2016, which legalized cannabis in California. It's also called AUMA. It's been called Mercer. Obviously, it was done by bureaucrats, because if I had written it, it would have been CHIP, Cannabis Helps Individuals Pain. I would have made it super simple. But we didn't do that, because we wanted to make it as complicated as possible. That Proposition 64 had 57.13% of the voters voting for cannabis. And that's why a lot of elected officials here in California feel that they have a mandate from their voters to continue to push for regulated, legal cannabis here in California. Now, the key factors for us getting it done for where we are right now, obviously, is the revenue. We all know that. Especially those of us that have gone through some really hard economic times when the budgets weren't that good. The minority impacts on communities helped a lot once it was explained. But someone had mentioned earlier about local control. Local control for us here in California was crucial, especially when we were trying to get law enforcement on board, who still pushing back on cannabis, who still talks about the dangers, not only driving while under the influence and other things, but are still out there kind of promoting some of the things that I don't think make sense right now, but we're still doing studies. We in the legislature have put together $3 million to look at the effects, for example, of cannabis and when you're driving. Field sobriety tests, how can you test the THC? It's lands in your system for a very long time. But we have to come up with safeguards for that and things in the road. There's still people that believe that cannabis is a gateway drug, a gateway to a lot of things. And there's some of us that believe it may not be a gateway drug. It might be a drive-through drug, drive-through McDonald's, Taco Bell, and other places. But we do have to take seriously the impacts that it can have on the road. And so, because of federal regulations, we have to go get our cannabis that we need to test for that at UC San Diego from Tennessee, because of federal regulations, which doesn't make any sense, because I think we have some of the best weed here. I can walk outside this building and get what we need. And the level that, and quite frankly, the level that we're really concerned about is not the same that we're getting from the research centers in Tennessee. The impact of this is not this 1960, 1970 weed anymore. And we need to test what people are using right now in 2018, 19, and 2020. And we need to get that research now done. And so we're doing that here in California right now. The CHP, which is our state police, they are starting to look at field sobriety tests to see the impacts and how people are driving. Whether it's, even if you're driving slow, you could present a great harm to people. And they're doing some field sobriety procedures and policies that hopefully they come up with pretty soon, that hopefully we can give out to you to use and have your law enforcement also use it. Also, one of the biggest problems that we're having right now is getting rid of the illegal cannabis market. And that is something that the state, and I'm embarrassed to say, we have not done anything, really. We haven't done a good job. The legislature tried to put $75 million in the budget to create kind of sort of an Elliott Ness type operation to shut down illegal cannabis. In this city right now, there are 134 legal retail cannabis shops in Los Angeles. There are 1,400 illegal ones in Los Angeles. And so when I wrote my bill after listening to Jeff Sessions talking about shutting down everything. My proposal was more of, why should we spend a whole lot of money shutting down the legal ones? Let's all come together. Now, this is probably a rare thing for a California elected official to say. This is where I would love Javier Becerra, our Attorney General, and the Attorney General of the United States, along with the FBI, DEA, California Highway Patrol, Los Angeles Police Department, Sheriff's Department, to all come together and work collaboratively to shut down all the illegal cannabis shops in California. And that's what we're pushing. Unfortunately, they didn't put the money in because they were waiting for the revenue. Well, the revenues have come in not the way we had expected, because if you can buy it cheaper across the street at an illegal shop that's open, why would you go there and spend $10, $20, $30 more from a legal shop? And so that's why it's really, really important for us in California right now to work real hard to shut down the legal operations here in California. And then finally, for me, I'm not trying to get everybody high. That's not my purpose of this exercise. We in California enjoy saying that we're the 5th largest economy in the world. Only Japan and United States, China, and I forgot the other, are ahead of us. Somebody said Texas. No, it's a country. Germany, thank you. And I want us to continue to grow. And I think this industry, and even in its infancy, if it's done correctly and it's done right, especially the medical side of it, the possibilities are enormous as far as the way we can take care of our seniors, our young people, our vets. But most important, as a California elected official, I would love for us to be the #1 industry in the country. And I've said it a million times. I know we probably have some of the best entrepreneurs that ever got in this business, because a lot of them ended up in jail. You know, there are people who sold cannabis on the street, then they sold it in the block, citywide. Some became statewide. Some went national. Some went international and ended up in jail. They understood accounts receivable, payable, marketing, and it could keep an inventory in their head. They were some of the best entrepreneurs this country probably ever had. Without an MBA, they didn't go to Wharton, Harvard, or Stanford to get their MBA. This is an opportunity to get people who have those business skills involved in that. But most important, I think, for California, and I think for the country, it's an industry, if it's well regulated, and I'll say that 3 times, well regulated, will not have the detrimental impacts on it. And that's what California is working toward, a well-regulated industry that doesn't produce harms to its citizens and to the state. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a few minutes left for question and answer. This session is being recorded, so if you would like to ask a question of the professor or the panelists, you'll need to make sure that you use a microphone and you speak into that so that we can effectively broadcast that. So questions for our panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go ahead and start right here. And wait a minute, please. Like I said, you need to make sure you've got the microphones.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Chris Taylor. I'm in the House in Wisconsin, and we don't have medical marijuana. We don't have anything, though we're surrounded by states that do. And one of the impediments is the medical society and the physician community. I'm wondering how you all dealt with that community in moving your policies forward.
Well, thanks for the question. In Maine, the doctors weren't front and center advocating for this, but on the other hand, they weren't really opposed either, because I think they saw it was happening. I think their concern has been public education, particularly for kids particularly for all of us to understand that the human brain doesn't stop developing until apparently around the age of 25. So partially in response to that, we've carved out a portion of our tax revenue specifically for public education, specifically aimed at children, and specifically aimed at having people understand that edibles work differently than smoking does in terms of delayed reaction. So the doctors were actually a very positive force in helping us do that. The other 6%, that's 6% of our tax revenue. The other 6% we set aside, and the only other money we set aside, is Assemblyman Joan Sawyer was saying, was for law enforcement, particularly the training of additional drug recognition officers, for just the reasons that he said, as we want to keep our highways safe.
And they were silent during that, especially pharma was very, very silent during this process. And then as we got closer to legalizing it, a curious thing happened. We were hearing stories of, and I won't mention the company, Bear Aspirin, that were doing research on cannabis medicine. About $200 million worth of initial research. I also mentioned that I've used THC ointment for various ailments that I've had with my hands. I think I'm getting the beginning of arthritis. And I said, one day we're going to see THC in Bengay. And someone said, it's almost here. I said, what do you mean it's almost here? They're already working on it for that day when it happens. So from farmers' standpoint, they know where the money is. And they also know if some of these remedies can supplant a lot of the medicines that are out there, especially those pills that cost $3,000 a pill, they better get on board quick, or this industry could supplant them in a lot of ways on a lot of different fronts. And so I think they've already embraced it. They don't talk about it a lot because they don't want everybody to just quickly move 100% away from pharmaceuticals. And I'm not saying all pharmaceuticals are good, and I'm not saying cannabis is good for every ailment. But there's room for both, and I think they've embraced it more than you realized it.
Okay. Other questions?
Yes, my name is Laurent Crenshaw, and I'm with a company called Ease, based here in California. Thank you all for this panel. It's been a very informative discussion, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness, whether working on the inside from the legislative standpoint or the research component. My question is in regards to the issue of home delivery that you discussed earlier, and you mentioned that Maine hadn't quite reached that standpoint yet. And my question is in regards to if you're continuing to look at that as an option, because I will confess that Ease is a company that facilitates the home delivery of the product safe, efficiently within California, and we've done so with virtually no incidences, and we preclude individuals from under the age of 21 from getting access to it. And what, as we've been looking at from a research standpoint, and what we think is important when legislatures are looking at creating a whole marketplace, is that home delivery basically could be a component that could keep individuals from driving while drugged, and also allows for access to communities that may not want a physical dispensary within their locality. However, they still want to ensure that individuals have access to the plant, because as you noted, most of these rules were passed under direct vote by constituencies or by individuals within the state. And so really I'm just curious as to how much you've really looked at that, and then also looking at it as being a component for helping to drive out the illicit marketplace that oftentimes still remains after states move down the path towards legalization, at least of certain components.
I think I've seen your billboards. In Maine, it was a very simple question. You raised the issue of home delivery, and most of my colleagues in the Republican Party said, "Are you freaking kidding me?" It was simply a matter of what we needed to do in order to be able to pass a bill in a legislature where, again, over half of the members of the House didn't even want to do anything because their constituents had voted no. So all the points you made, we heard. I'm not going to argue with any of them, but it was simply a matter of counting noses and getting the number of votes we needed. will, 10 years from now, will there be home delivery? I have no doubt about it, but it was too early for us, at least in our state.
Ladies and gentlemen, our time is up for this morning, partly because you've got committee luncheons that are coming up that you need to get to. So would you gentlemen mind maybe taking a moment, staying after just a little bit if you'd like to? The committee will reconvene in this room at 12:15. Oh, in room 403?
Yeah, it's reversed.
I apologize, thank you. The committee will meet in room 403 for members of this committee for the Arts and Incarcerated Youth Luncheon. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our panelists and Professor Maikos a hand.
Thank you.